Welcome to Sessions 1 of the ITH conference. The topic for this session is International Trade and Health Outlooks, the Needed Paradigm Shift. This session will discuss the future situation of international trade and health, which will be shaped by the current situation of public health emergency, especially COVID-19, and how lessons learned can be applied to balance trade and health interests, and how we can shape the will of concerned stakeholders and what paradigm shift is needed. To provide us with more detail, introduce the panelists and moderate these sections. Please welcome the moderator for these sections, Mr. Nati Vijit Saupasat, Counselor, Permanent Mission of Thailand to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva, to the stage. Please, sir.
Thank you, everyone. Could I invite the rest of the panelists, please? Roger Kemp, and I'll do the introductions later. Ambassador Pim Chunok, and of course, Dr. Matthias Heid, please. So without further ado, welcome to session 1. I was introduced as the permanent counselor at the Permanent Mission of Thailand in Geneva, but that's not important at the moment. The only important thing that you should know about me was I worked as a journalist for about 5 years at the Nation newspaper, and I aspire to be a journalist in my future years. So this is one of the things that I have. One of the skills I've acquired, and today I won't be working as much as a diplomat, more so as a journalist to lead on this discussion that I hope will be interactive. Of course, we have here panelists which are truly star-studded. One common fact about us is that we're all from Geneva, and we're all jet-lagged.
So we missed the -3 degrees in Geneva.
Yes, the heat is a bit much, isn't it, Ambassador? Yes. Directly to my left is Ambassador Pichinov von Gopon Pitfield.
Hello, good afternoon. Yes.
Of course, Ambassador is one of the foremost experts at the Ministry of Commerce. I'm not sure if any of your bosses are here, but
no,
they
not
would
my
agree.
boss. Not my boss is here.
That's possibly
But
because
some of my colleagues are here. So
it's possibly because she has no bosses at the Ministry of Commerce, and we're very happy to have her here. Ambassador Pim Chunok is working as a permanent representative of Thailand to the WTO and the World WIPO in Geneva, Switzerland, and she's been very kind in accepting the invitation to speak at this panel. So we very much look forward to hearing what she has to say. And next, of course, I have Roger Kemp. Roger Kemp is currently a counselor, intellectual property, government procurement and competition division at the WTO. He's extremely experienced, worked on many issues that would be of interest to us here. One of the words in his resume, as you can see before you, is the word TRIPS. But we'll see whether you have any questions for him regarding that later on. Of course, he's also worked at other places such as the European Commission at its headquarters in Brussels. He was responsible for IP issues in WTO and WIPO as well. So your wealth of knowledge here is keenly looked forward to in this opening session. And finally, of course, we have Dr. Matthias Helbel. His position is a scientist, evidence to policy and impact research for health development department at the WHO, the World Health Organization. He specializes in promoting research and development of new health technologies, especially in low and middle income countries. So he's going to bring a perspective to this discussion that's very interesting. We're looking forward to hearing it as well. As I was briefing the panelists here, we were going to say that this is going to be an interactive discussion. So there will be slides, I assume, if appropriate, but what we want to do at this opening session is to keep the discussions lively and interactive. And of course, we would welcome questions from you as well. Okay, if we're all ready to begin, perhaps I could start with you, Roger, with one provoking question. Has trade really affected medical goods and services in the past?
Well, thank you very much, Nati. And had you told me that you, in your former life, you were a journalist, I would have given more thoughts to sit here or not. But I'm glad that you will make it a lively session. Before I get to your question, may I just very briefly, and this is what you see actually in the back here, say that what I'm going to bring to your attention today is to a large extent based on a study which we did at the WTO together with World Bank colleagues, and it has this slightly strange name, trade therapy, but it's essentially about deepening cooperation to strengthen pandemic defenses. And yes, Nati, you mentioned my main area of specialization, which is the TRIPS agreement, intellectual property rights. But don't be disappointed if I don't mention those in this session, because I will have the opportunity in session 2 to speak to the TRIPS decision, the pandemic declaration, the instruments which were adopted at the WTO Ministerial Conference last June. So coming to your question after this lengthy introduction, so I personally believe that yes, trade played a key role for global health security during the pandemic. What you could already see before the pandemic, trade in medical goods was already growing at faster rate than trade in medical goods in general. And this is, I'm only using 4 slides and only graphs, so don't worry about a lengthy presentation. But this is actually to illustrate what we've seen since 2010, 2011. So since the beginning of the pandemic, trade in medical goods soared by 13.2%. With critical COVID-19 products, such as face masks, raising at a rate of almost 500%, so trade increase of almost 500%. This number contrasts the negative growth rates of overall trade during the pandemic and highlights the key role that trade played in improving countries' access to essential medical products to deal with the crisis. And so trade in medical goods increased in the decade before the pandemic already. But as you see on this graph, the solid line highlights that between between 2010 and 2019, we saw an annual average rate of 4.5% growth rate. And then compared to 2.8%, this is the dotted line, average growth rate for trade in general. So very important, not only in times of pandemic, but also in normal times, trade in medical goods. Now, what we also observe is that, yes, China and India have an outstanding role in this context, but still the high-income economies represent the bulk of exports and imports in this area. And Nati, if I may, just a few words about services, because I think it's also an important area, and I have sort of a slide here to show as well, which is interesting, because I think in contrast to what we've observed in the goods area, services trade actually decreased during the pandemic. And you see this actually quite remarkably here for what we call in our jargon modes 2 and 4. I know this is a cross-border supply of services through movement of persons. This is the yellow bar, minus 58% during the for obvious reasons, and likewise minus 39% for what is movement of health workforces. On the other hand, we have an increase for two other sort of modes of delivery, and that is the cross-border supply of health services, as well as the delivery through sort of local establishment. But what is important here is, I think, the 14% increase in the cross-border supply of health services, which seems to indicate that indeed the remote supply of those services has gained in importance as much as digital health services. Just to conclude, perhaps a few final words about the challenges, because what we have seen in the trade area, yes, open trade, definitely combined with government support, stimulated the rapid development, as you all know, of vaccines. With the new technology, the development of vaccines against COVID-19 was fast and production accelerated. From nearly zero in 2020, we saw 4.4 billion doses traded actually in 2021 out of a total of close to 12 billion doses, which were sort of both found in export and domestic supply. And now this all sounds very sort of positive, but then I think although we saw this export of vaccines rising, there was a concentrated nature of the production together with supply chain disruptions and also regulatory impediments, which contributed to create scarcity problems and something we all talk about Geneva on a daily basis, an issue of equity. So unequal distribution of supply across the globe. And I will also get back to this with a specific focus on Thailand in my second presentation later in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger, for being brief. A follow-up question, if I may. What do these statistics mean exactly for treatment and treatment of the pandemic, resolving the pandemic, specifically in layman's terms? What does this rise in the trade of medical goods actually mean for the rest of us?
Well, I think it shows the importance of keeping trade open, because that indeed will help to get people accessing what is needed, so the critical health products. And certainly I think it should be the basis when we talk about paradigm shift and changes that are needed, to understand that when decisions are taken to block trade in medical goods and services, this will actually have a negative impact on global health security. So I think in a few words, this is what you can learn from those statistics.
You're being very diplomatic about it. But before I go on to more follow-up questions for you, could I ask the ambassador to follow up on that discussion? Is trade really open when it comes to medical goods and services?
You won't give me the chance to thank you, Kun Chaem, for inviting me back home. Sorry.
Please do. Thank you, Chaem.
Sorry, before I say something, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the Ministry of Public Health, with whom I have been working with for, I don't know, I don't want to say how long, but since at least 2004, 2005, when we were doing FTA negotiations together, and we still keep contact to this day. So I'm very glad to be with you here again. And I know that this audience is very intellectual and very challenging, so I will try to do my best. I think I will address your question, Kun Kong, as well as make my presentation Before I go into details about trade, maybe I want to recap what are international trade rules that are relevant to the healthcare sectors. You know, there are three components of international trade that are key. That are keys to the healthcare, trade in goods, trade in services, and intellectual properties. And there have been a lot of changes on the rules and also on the development in these areas since the trade war between US, China, due to COVID, and now with Russia and Ukraine war. So healthcare sector has been quite dramatically affected by these factors. I don't think I have time to explain in details on each things that have happened, but I will go through my list quickly. That several things that, in my view, have to be taken into account when Thailand and other developing countries make strategies regarding the future development of healthcare sector as outcomes of these changes, and which Dr. Sampan said call for paradigm shift. The first one is the supply chain disruption. There's been a lot of things, and this is maybe something that is relevant to a question by Kun Kong about international trade in goods in medical services and supplies. The second things that happen and have a lot of impact is digitalization of healthcare sector in the past, which has been accelerated by trend of work from home and then other things, you know, like Roger has just said that mode one of services have been growing quite a lot despite other modes, and I think that is a very important development. The third issue I want to raise is that the national security concern and the discussion about strategic sectors by many countries, especially the US. And there's a risk, or I don't know, maybe not, but there's a tendency, a possibility that healthcare and pharmacies and technology will be considered as strategic by many key players in the world. And this, to me, they will have impact on innovation development as well as access to technology and R&D for us developing countries. The next thing that has been developing, but maybe doesn't have a lot of direct impact on healthcare, but it will certainly add cost to the future economic sector, is climate and green policy. I think we will hear a lot of greening of this, greening of those. Maybe there will be greening of medical services or medical goods in the future. But right now, maybe it is a little bit slow in development. And last but not least, because of these changes, it has generated a lot of thoughts in many major countries. So there are in Geneva lots of discussion on emerging new or revised rules to take care of this concern. Waiver extension, I think, but I will not talk about that. The TRIPS waiver will be discussed by Roger and with Professor Andrew. Second thing that I think at least among the ambassadors, these are very big issues going on. We are fighting a lot. It's about subsidies. How our U.S. is putting a lot of subsidies for healthcare, for green. You know, you may have heard about it. It's going to be a major dispute in Geneva about how countries should subsidize their own considering future technology without disrupting trade or creating barriers to trade to other countries. And, the next thing is that, and then national security concern. I will address the major players of healthcare sector, but then I will not elaborate on it much because I have to answer Mr. Kong's question on trade only. I just go quickly that when I've said that there are three rules or three components of healthcare, goods, services, and intellectual properties, major players or interests are a bit different, but not that much different. You know, the major countries or group of countries who have the most important benefits are, and I think a lot of at stake are the European community. The EU is accounting for at least 45% of trade in medicine products, a lot followed by Switzerland, US, and the United Kingdom. And no wonder these were important players when we had the TRIPS negotiations last year. But on the other hand, there are other developing countries who are also major players. Of course, India is a big manufacturer, but not so much a big exporter for now. And also South Africa, and also there are other countries such as Japan and South Korea. So in terms of trade in goods, the EU have a huge grip and interest in medicine. On services, I think the picture is quite mixed. The major exporters of medical services are the United States, but the share and the potentials are quite debatable. Like India, I think have great potential to increase the mode one, which is the supply of medical services through online, telemedicine, to make it easy for the audience in the medical sector. But this is a cake that can be grabbed by many countries. So even Thailand, I think, has potential to do more on mode one in services. And last but not least, the intellectual property and vaccine. I think this is a very important picture, because even though the EU and Switzerland still have a majority part of the export and manufacturing of vaccines, many developing countries do have more shares and more interest in vaccine. China and India both had to step up their production of vaccine during COVID a lot, but China do export a little to other countries, but India was using their own vaccine for their own population primarily, and export the rest to their neighboring countries. China also did the same, but China has more export to other countries. What I think is important, and maybe I will address this tomorrow, not today, is that because of this, they have affected how each countries are playing their roles in the negotiations at the WTO and I think beyond. But Thailand, believe it or not, well, we should believe it because we are a great country. We are the number 10 world exporters of vaccines. Well, so we are among the 3 developing countries who are in the top 10 of vaccine exporters. Maybe not so much as manufacturer, because the total amount produced in Thailand is not much, but we export quite a majority part of our vaccine. And I think that's also a very interesting fact for us today. In terms of international trade, my 2 cents of thought is that there have not been more barriers in vaccine than other things. But what is lacking is, like Dr. Samphan said, many countries lack access to vaccines. Right now in Thailand, many of my friends here, they have more than 4 shots of vaccine. I already have 3 shots, because in Switzerland, they wouldn't let you do it more than 3, And now vaccines are available everywhere in Thailand. But we have to be mindful that in Africa, many countries still don't have access to vaccines. Even though vaccines are plentiful now in the world, how can we ensure that these are important? This important thing is available to those in need. So maybe we also think about this kind of thing when we discuss either today or tomorrow about the role that and strategy that Thailand and other developing countries can think about. I say developing countries because I don't think the developed countries need to have strategy in healthcare. They are doing very well, but we never know. Okay, so yeah, that's my answer. There's no ordinary major trade measures. There may be some export restrictions, but nevertheless, I think what is lacking, what is actually preventing access to vaccine by those who are really in need of that. So that's for now.
Follow-up question, Ambassador, if I may. I think you hit the you hit the right point there where you said there was unequal access, and yet again you said that there aren't any trade measures that are imposed specifically for vaccines, for example. Then what? Could you answer perhaps why there is such an inequality in access in that case?
Well, there were measures that were imposed during COVID time, mostly export restrictions. But in case of Thailand, it was not on vaccine, but on like the mask. That now you find it everywhere. I think maybe we need to utilize more international cooperation on vaccine distribution. For example, like COVAX mechanism and something. I'm not sure that the lack of access is attributable to lack of financial means or not. I really don't know, because what I heard was that the vaccine was available by all those who have patent, Pfizer or whoever. They are ready to sell it at low cost. But of course, when you talk to many countries who have, in COVID time, barely money to buy food, maybe vaccine was not on their highest priority. In any case, I think more international cooperation can help alleviate and ensure that at least vaccines that are not used or there are surplus in many countries are made available to Africa and other LDC countries. I'm not sure whether it should be free of charge or not. This depends on who you are talking to. But in any case, the supplies are now available, and so we should help those who are really in need of them. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador. No follow-up questions yet. Roger, did you want to come in
Just
before
a very
briefly
quick
before
comment,
I move on
if
to
I may,
Yep.
because something which struck me actually when about a week ago I read in sort of Swiss newspapers. The government of Switzerland had ordered something like, I think, 32 million doses of vaccines. Now, what happens? Because there's no demand anymore for vaccination, they sit on a stock of roughly 17 million doses, which are not used anymore. And what struck me in this newspaper article was the report that the Swiss government actually offered those doses to COVAX, to sort of developing countries for free, and there was not a single taker. That I think is interesting to note when we speak about vaccine inequity, because I think there's a distinction between the early times of the pandemic and what we are facing in terms of supply today. And I just thought, this is an anecdote, but which tells you, and I think Thailand is in a slightly similar position. I will show this in my second presentation, where today there's a surplus in terms of vaccines, which are available in the country. Just as a side.
That's an interesting fact, Roger, and we would love to know why there weren't any takers on that. But
I wanted to, but they don't
Please.
allow me. I'm not old enough to have the first vaccine. Maybe that should be thankful for.
Yes, Dr. Matthias, did you want to come in on this issue or another?
Yeah, I would like to come in on this issue. But first of all, thank you so much for the organizers for inviting us all. I think it's a very timely moment to get together and discuss these interrelationships between international trade and health. Now, coming back to this question of why wasn't there any taker, I think one issue was also in the middle of the pandemic, some developed countries realized that they had an excess supply of vaccines, and then they approached African countries and told them, we can basically give you 10 million doses with an expiration date of 2 weeks. We ship them to you, please do the necessary. Now, when you look at developing countries, for them it was a huge undertaking to vaccinate a lot of people, because their health systems are basically made to vaccinate children. Now they're in front of this historic challenge to vaccinate the whole population. And of course, if the expiration date is very short, they cannot guarantee these ultra cold chains. It's really a huge undertaking. when I when the pandemic started, I was working in Manila, and we also at the Asian Development Bank tried to help countries to purchase vaccines. But for example, several of our members, of ADB members, said we cannot actually accept any mRNA vaccines because we don't have this ultra cold chain. So it shows that there are a lot of limitations at the country level to actually vaccinate people, especially within a very short notice.
And Dr. Matthias, one of the interesting statistics that Ambassador Vipchinok just noted is that Thailand is among the top 10 exporters, if I'm correct, of vaccines. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, we were struggling to come up with vaccines and produce vaccines, research them and test them. And now we're one of the leading countries in the world in this regard. So in your view, there is probably value in strengthening domestic R&D systems, I assume?
Yeah, so just to share with you, at WHO since 2019, we have a science division. It's a new division because at WHO we believe that we're a science-based organization and we need to promote, of course, science. And I'm working in the Research for Health department where we try to basically help our member states to better know which are the upcoming diseases, how to do foresight at the country level. We also help them in terms of ethical questions. And in my unit, we look at how to build domestic R&D systems. Because I think there is really a global consensus that we need to foster local manufacturing. And we believe that local manufacturing can only be sustainable if there is an appropriate R&D system in place that deliver new products to be manufactured at the local level. And that's why I think we need to undertake a lot of efforts to really strengthen the local R&D system. And for example, in the case of Thailand, you have a lot of good research institutes. And I think in terms of outputs, in terms of academic outputs, these researchers are really outstanding. They produce a lot of innovations. But now the question is, how can this be translated into patents at the national level? How can they make sure that they can maybe create their own company? How can maybe the Thai government create kind of incubators that help these scientists to create their own companies? And I think this will also help, of course, the Thai health system to be better prepared for the next pandemic, because then you have a lot of local knowledge, local R&D skills, and can also translate this into more local manufacturing of vaccines and medicines. Thank you.
Yes, but Thailand's example can't be used worldwide, can it? We were one of the more successful ones, I believe. But there are countries throughout the world that are struggling to do this, I assume.
Yes, of course, Thailand is an exception, and I think each country has its own place in this also regional and global value chain of medical technologies, and we basically need to develop a strategy that is adapted to the country itself and try to see what's the capacity within the country.
Thank you.
At this stage, maybe I will just provide quickly the statistics of the share of world export of vaccine, of COVID-19 vaccine. The major number one exporter is China, of course, accounting for 40% of COVID vaccine export, followed by the EU at 24.6, India at 16.3, US at 10.6, and followed by Russia, Korea, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, and Thailand. Thailand's shares in export is only 0.6%, but that is the share of export. But as I said, in terms of medical supplies and pre-COVID and post-COVID vaccine export, there's been a lot of component in terms of manufacturing versus export. It's not that the major manufacturers export everything. So this is something that we have to think when we want to think about alliance or in our future of paradigm shift.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for mentioning the word paradigm shift. I do realize that this session is for us to talk about a need for a paradigm shift and whether it is needed or not. But before we even go there, let's try to lay out all the problems we have in the world. And I'm going to put you back on the spot, Roger, on this. Governments throughout the world haven't been exactly helpful, have they?
Well, as you pointed out, I will try to give a diplomatic answer to this.
I'm supposed to be diplomat, but I have never been diplomatic. Good AM agrees.
But yes, I think as a consequence of the pandemic, we did see countries taking measures which are, if you want to describe them as such, which were discriminatory policies and as an exception to existing WTO principles. And I want to show you one more slide, which is actually illustrating the evidence on the patterns of import and export policies, including tariffs, taxes, quotas, and licensing requirements, which affected COVID-19 related medical goods since the beginning of the pandemic. And it's by no means an exception. What we found is that more than 2/3 of all countries in the world resorted to such policy interventions to ensure domestic accessibility. I mean, if you are sort of a government, what do you have first in mind is your own population. And so that, I think, was the driving force for many to take those measures. And more than 95% of these interventions lasted longer than 3 months, which for us is an indicator that what should be temporary in nature was exceeded in many places by substantially longer duration of those measures. And just perhaps to explain, what you see in the upper line is sort of indicating the export reforms which countries have taken, but right below, you also see restrictive export curbs, which stay at a sort of relatively high level, and then below we have sort of import reforms and restrictive import curbs. So lots of measures which were adopted by countries in the time of the pandemic. And just the last slide, which sort of gives you an idea of the sort of impact in terms of trade costs. Because some of these measures definitely, when it comes to export bans or restrictions, worsened global health security. And the empirical analysis which we have done in this report actually shows, and is reflected in this figure, shows that restrictive trade policies contributed to increases in trade costs of sometimes more than 50%. And you were mentioning face masks. This is the example of face masks where you see this sort of massive increase in price in this critical period at the beginning of the pandemic. So that, of course, has an impact on consumers because it's becoming more expensive and less available. So these were, I think, some of the sort of downsides. And if you allow me just a few words about what I think we should also bear in mind, the positive kind of measures which governments have taken as a consequence of the pandemic and which facilitated trade or eased regulatory bottlenecks and also thus promoted the diffusion of health technologies. And to give you some examples, some countries did indeed expedite the transition from paper-based, to electronic documents, which customs were dealing with, which is an important movement to help accelerating access to critical products. And also on the regulatory side, you did see the sort of increase of emergency use authorizations to fast-track the approval of vaccines and other critical goods. So these are positive elements. On the IP side, intellectual property, you also saw some interesting movements, such as the fast-track approval of patents which were sort of requested for COVID-19 related vaccines, enhanced search facilities, which I think greatly helps also to have competitor products on the market. If you have a better picture of patents, it will be easier for you to come up with a sort of competing product. And of course, in some cases, the grant of compulsory licenses. May I just, on one final word on what I think we often tend to forget is sort of government procurement, because that, in the end, is perhaps one of the most important factors. You know, we have a nice time talking about trade in goods, trade in services, intellectual property, but if there's no taker at the end of the production line, forget it. I mean, your production line will go nowhere. So that means a government needs to reflect about, you know, sound government procurement policies, which actually make the production sustainable, but which also help to make access to the vaccines and other products affordable for people in the country. And maybe I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And you know, you said all that in a very neutral tone, especially your previous slide, if we could return to that, where you said that 2/3 of countries were using trade restrictive measures. That's a huge amount, isn't it? And headlines would be screaming everywhere. You know, we're trying to not sensationalize everything, but that's a significant number. Exactly how has this translated into the real world? What effect has this kind of trade policy intervention had to the people of the world? And do you think any kind of what kind of impact exactly has this had on our attempt to fight the pandemic?
Well,
yeah, Matthias can come in later.
I mean, you can, depending on which kind of measures you're looking at, I think when it comes to sort of restrictive measures, of course, by times it has led to what, you know, we commonly refer to inequity, because the goods were not traded as they could have been because of restrictive measures. But at the same time, because of the sort of facilitating measures, I think there were also examples, you know, in this case where indeed the measures taken helped to accelerate access to what was needed in the country. So I can go both ways, depending on what countries decided to do.
Okay, so it's not all bad. Matthias, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, because I actually often thought about this question whether international trade had helped to fight the pandemic or not. And I think for me, it's really a very hard question. I think the glass is half full or half empty. As Roger said, yeah, we've seen trade facilitating measures, but also we have seen measures to restrict trade in a lot of medical products. So, but I think what also needs to be said that public health is always very much a reason for exception in the WTO trading rules. So every WTO member can actually take measures to protect public health. So those measures are not, I would say, against WTO law as long as they're implemented in a certain way. But I think one of the key issues was during the pandemic that a lot of governments approached the big producers of vaccines, and they were less than a handful, and ordered vaccines, yet it was very unclear how much they would get, at which price, by when. And so they were a little bit at the mercy of this, very few producers, and there was basically no mechanism to guarantee a fair distribution of the existing vaccines. And that's also why we've seen a huge vaccine inequity. And I think it really cannot be that until now in Africa, not all healthcare workers are vaccinated. So until today, we've seen, or we were still witnessing this huge vaccine inequity. And I think trade, the international trade regime has worked in a sense that we haven't seen huge trade barriers, but at the same time, it didn't really help to prevent this big vaccine inequity. Over to you.
Please, Ambassador.
Yes, I think the question is it acceptable to increase price of masks during pandemics? My answer as the ambassador to WTO would be actually yes. But I would say yes, you can increase price of mask.
Controversial,
but is
Ambassador.
it acceptable? I don't know. It depends on who, which angle you are speaking from. But as both gentlemen said, actually the price increase is not against WTO rules because you can, as long as you don't do it in a discriminatory manner, either with other countries or within among the domestic and foreign producers, and transparent. So I don't know whether the price increase met the transparency criteria, but if it was not discriminatory, then nobody could bring you to court. But I think what was more controversial measures was the import and export measures. But again, like Matthias said, there's a big exception in terms of to protect public health in the WTO rules, so you can also do it. I think the question that was quite controversial during the height of COVID was the patent. But I will not go to that, too controversial for me, even though I love controversies. But I think there are more people who are better qualified than me to talk about the impact of patent and intellectual property. So I will leave it to that. Yeah.
Do you want to comment on this, Roger?
Not on patents, I leave this to the next session, as I said. But just because, everybody is talking about export restrictions, and Ambassador, I think you also took part in this. What for me was an interesting experience, what is the basis is, yes, you can take certain measures, these are exceptions permitted under WTO rules, but then in the run-up to what should have been the date of the 12th Ministerial Conference in December 2022, we had a sort of process led by the New Zealand ambassador to the WTO, which came up with a draft declaration on, pandemics, and that actually was quite explicit on export restrictions. So we went a step further, basically calling for not applying those restrictions anymore. That was not acceptable to certain WTO members, and as the date of the conference had to be moved to June this last year, in that period, the declaration, the draft declaration was completely reviewed, and what came out was actually a sort of good intention type provision on export restrictions, but nothing which sort of explicitly prohibits those kind of restrictions. So that also shows the dynamics, at the WTO, where different interests come together and in the end shape what is now the pandemic declaration I would speak to in the next session.
Yes, Ambassador.
I think there's one sentence that maybe the next session or tomorrow's session can answer. At the crux of the TRIPS waiver discussion is whether access, whether patent protection is a barrier or not a barrier for less, poorer countries to access medicine and essential supplies. I think it was the big question. I don't have answer to that because I may think that access to patent as such is not a barrier because if you want to produce vaccine, you need to have other facilities and ecosystem. You need to have a lab. You need to have HR. You have to have people and a lot of things, investment to do that. But I talked to my colleagues from India and South Africa. They still think that access or to a vaccine is prevented by patent protection. So maybe I would leave this question to other panels to think to let me know their views as well.
I'm feeling a bit sad that everything fun is being left for the next session, but I'll live with it. And I do understand that we're trying to lay down the groundwork for the rest of the session. So there's a lot to look forward to in the next few sessions, and I'll be keenly looking forward to it and asking questions from the floor, controversial questions. But Ambassador, you touched on this when you talked about the various players in the world when it comes to trying to transform the healthcare sector. But could you perhaps give us a picture of how negotiations are going on in the WTO? And perhaps a very wide picture so that we can better understand what the key issues are that are being discussed with regard to the healthcare sector within the WTO and what the more relevant issues and the more progressive issues are when that are being negotiated, as well as how successful the negotiations have been so far. Because from the outside, when we're looking in, we see that discussions at the WTO are, well, for lack of a better word, deadlocked. But then as we saw during the ministerial conference, the 12th ministerial conference, it's not as deadlocked as it seems, but well, there are several views on that. So perhaps you could provide us with a general picture of what's going on with the negotiations in the WTO.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think I was planning to do it tomorrow, but yeah, I'll just touch on the negotiation aspect. Basically, like I said, the major components of healthcare are in goods, services, and intellectual property. But in goods, there are sub-agreement like trade facilitation, tariff reduction, export, import, blah, blah, blah. There are a lot of details in there. And on services, there are ongoing negotiations to liberalize further services too, but healthcare is not a high priority for many countries. I think for now, there are a lot of negotiations that are on the TRIPS agreement, and especially the extension of the waiver that was agreed during the MC12. Basically, the waiver covered only COVID-19 vaccine. Okay, it was so in a sense it's quite limited in scope, but it is more flexible in other areas. And two other issues that emerged from the negotiations that I think is important for us developing countries. First one is eligibility. The waiver was available. I'm sorry for the TRIPS people who are going to talk about it. The waiver was available to all developing countries except those who have high share of export. Now, China, you were excluded de facto by this. China fought hard not to have this carve out of the availability of the TRIPS waiver. I think the first draft, if I can explain a little bit more, the carve out, in my opinion, it will have important bearings in to other developing countries as well. When I heard about it, I was, man, I cannot accept that. What happened if they are going to do it to other countries in the future? And also maybe the threshold or the minimis will be lowered from 10% to other percent. I think that was a bit unfair. But of course, when you look at the statistics of export, China accounts for 40% of export of vaccine, COVID vaccine. Basically, developed countries who own the patent, they just were not happy that China would be able to even export more. It's as simple as that. But for me, as a negotiator, I think this was quite important in terms of principle of negotiations. And I think I will be careful to follow this threshold or de minimis exception, whatever you call it in the future, because I think it might come in other issues when we talk about subsidies or something, for example. So that's an important issue that ongoing now, whether to expand the TRIPS waiver scope to therapeutics and other products. I think the Ministry of Public Health and Ministry of Commerce may not have one common position on this yet. I don't want to say it here too publicly, but understandably, when you have a lot of flexibility on use compulsory licensing, it may have impact on innovation. And at the same time, maybe even Thailand may not yet be owning a lot of patents in terms of vaccine, either for COVID or any future vaccine. But we are emerging as important healthcare players Do we want other countries to have free access to our patent as well in the future? It's not only that Thailand can use patent of other countries, but vice versa. So this is something that I will have to leave to the healthcare profession in Thailand to decide and think further. What are our national position on healthcare development? Are we going to be positive or more offensive, or are we defensive? I don't have an answer yet, but any rules at the WTO we have implications either way. It can be good or it can be prohibitive on our innovation as well. So I want them to think carefully. Other issues that are ongoing, I will stop very soon. It's not directly on healthcare, but there are interest in what we call digital economy agenda. Here, healthcare will be affected or relevant in terms of after digitalization of healthcare sector. Will there be limitations, or will there be more aggressive asking for access of patients' data, for example? Access to data is is a key negotiating issues under the e-commerce umbrella, but there was no distinguish between what kind of data. Is it just general consumer data, like you buy stuff from Amazon, or does it include patients' data? This has not been discussed yet, but many developed countries said last Friday that data access is one of the major issues they are going to go forward in the new further negotiations at the WTO. Other thing that I want to highlight, maybe not so much, yeah, but if there's a time for later, there is outside WTO issues that are ongoing that will have impact on healthcare and other sectors. Is the spat between U.S., EU, and China. It's not only about the trade war or the tech war, the chip war, but it is about national security concern. This would make, COVID and the war have made many developed countries realize that there are strategic sectors that they have to take measures to protect. And I think that healthcare sector, because of the importance and the strategic nature of healthcare sector to any country's development, you should follow this up later. But I don't have time to elaborate on that. I would just highlight these few issues that will be important for the healthcare professions to think about.
And that last issue is going to be one of the highlights of session 3, which I also am keenly looking forward to, about the geopolitics of trade. Yes, if you could briefly...
Just an anecdote. So I visited recently the European headquarters of the world's biggest medical devices manufacturer. And the question you are addressing, Ambassador, data, is actually one of for me, one of the biggest questions right now, because with pacemakers, for example, you collect massive amounts of data about, and that of course, but it's not only those data, it's also the data about the functioning of the devices. And so I think if we start discussing this, you need to look at it from different perspectives, no? Because one, personally, I could accept a more proprietary view. When it comes to the functioning of your own devices, you will want to know how this works out, and the data are pretty much linked to those devices. And then comes the much broader issue of the data which are linked to patients, even if they are anonymized. How does the access to those data work? And currently we don't have any regime for that. So I think it's an interesting question to follow up.
Thank you. And I'd like, if those in the audience haven't noted so far, Ambassador Pimchanok is not using one smartwatch, he's using 2 smartwatches. Lots of people collecting data on her.
They know exactly when I had a heart attack, when I heard a minister from India making the speech on agriculture at the MC.
I love how direct you are. Thank you. Dr. Matthias, we're going into very advanced grounds now, digital economy, collection of data, but the South isn't there yet. The developing countries are not there yet. So I was just wondering, how can international trade contribute to the build-up of domestic R&D products and bring the South closer to the North?
I think this discussion about services is a good one, and when it comes to digital trade, also in the area of health, there are actually a lot of opportunities for the so-called South. I know that, for example, in the US, they often send X-rays to India to get a second opinion of a medical doctor in India. So this is typical of mode one trade, where the consumer and the patient or the other part stays in the respective country. We've also seen in the Philippines that they use the Philippines as a hub to transcribe medical prescriptions in the US. So this can also help basically to create jobs in low and middle income countries. But of course, there's also a risk that resources that are already scarce in the health sector in low and middle income countries are drawn into these jobs for exports. And the question is how to balance these opportunities and risks. And we also see this in other modes of supply, like, for example, in medical travel, where foreign patients come to your health system and request treatment. This can, again, draw away scarce resources to treat foreign patients. So I think it's not easy to balance this kind of export interests and earning foreign exchanges with actually public health interests that are very much domestic. And so I think it needs a very, very good balance to get most of these opportunities. Over to you.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, I just, if you have some time, I think I didn't answer directly your question about the major players in the negotiation and what we should do about it. Like I said, the picture in healthcare is quite very simply dominated by many developed countries, but there are emerging players among developing countries. I can mention one, of course, India and South Africa and China are emerging powerhouse in healthcare sector. But at the negotiation at the WTO, South Africa was the foremost was the one that pushed most about the TRIPS waiver. Very eloquently, I'm sorry, I'm very biased. I like the minister from South Africa very much. He's very eloquent. But India and South Africa have some kind of important role for them because they are manufacturers for their own continent or their own satellite neighboring countries. So I think this is a very important fact. But then, of course, when we talk about major players at the WTO right now, maybe not only in healthcare, but you are seeing many developing countries as well, like Indonesia, very, very in full force in negotiation because they represent the G33. We see Brazil very active from the Latin American. I try to be active as much as I can to protect interests of Thailand. But I think the paradigm shift has to be taken into account that other developing countries are playing more important roles and contribute to the world global economy. But how can the future trade rules be conducive or be supportive of not only equity to access to vaccine, but to all? I think this is a big question right now. In Davos last week, I believe they were talking about this, the disruption from a lot of conflicts, and that it's not digital divide or whatever, it's the gap between people, rich and poor, that kind of stuff. I think this is a very important issue. So what should Thailand do in building alliances we have to think about our own position, which I think the public health should not only talk among yourself, but talk to the trade, to foreign affairs, to the academia, to of course you have active NGOs already, but I think in terms of healthcare, the only thing I would leave is that we have great potential to be a hub or to be a powerhouse of healthcare, good services, and in terms of innovation or intellectual property, I am not so sure. I heard we are building up slowly, but don't discount ourselves for the future. So that is what I just want to say for now. Yes, there is a need for paradigm shift, but we need to where we will stand in the future. I'm not sure that Thailand has a clear answer right now, but major players are not only developed countries now. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for that segue into the question. Do we actually need a paradigm shift? And if we do, what exactly do we have to do to achieve this? I'm cognizant that we have about 25 minutes left, and that when we
the negotiations are not only at WTO, but at FTA and other emerging forum as well, like the Indo-Pacific, which focus exclusively on regulatory negotiations. So regulatory is also important, in healthcare sector.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and we do need to have some time at the end for a Q&A from the audience as well. But if, Roderick, I could ask you first, do we need a paradigm shift? And if so, how does the WTO and perhaps the World Bank wish to achieve this? How do you propose to achieve this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And what I think my main message would be, let's first build on what we have achieved during the pandemic, because we tend to forget that there have been major steps which have been made towards more cooperation, other things which I think today are much better established, and we risk losing some of those achievements if we just talk about paradigm shift in abstract. So I think that is important, and maybe to note here, the report to which I referred at the beginning of this session does include indeed an action plan, and this action plan is sort of threefold. It has sort of proposed action at sort of national government level. It has a couple of proposed action points for what could improve cooperation in general. And then it does address what international organization like mine could also contribute in terms of being better prepared for the next health crisis. And if I may just take the time at least to develop on what could be done at national level, what the report proposes, and what we as international organizations could do. So at national level, what we see as potential sort of action points is the elimination of tariffs and internal taxes, which are sort of imposed on essential medical products. And this, of course, goes beyond COVID, as you can hear, to establish mechanisms for governments to provide funding, because money is of essence in all of this. So there must be sound mechanisms to discuss this funding issue and to sort of coordinate the production and supply of critical goods. And that, to some extent, also goes beyond borders, because not every country in the world will have production. So we need to have this cooperation in place in order to deal with the best places to manufacture a given product. And then to establish also a dialogue. I mean, that sounds very simple, but a dialogue between trade and health authorities and other key stakeholders to actually understand what we are discussing today. What is the impact of trade in support of health policy, health security? So this must be not only understood, but also maximized. And this is, I think, where national governments have an important role to play. And for intellectual property rights, to put a more positive spin on this, I think what really at national level needs to be considered is, we have a lot of discussion about TRIPS flexibilities, But what about the implementation and use? And we get to this, I guess, in the next session. But that needs to reflection at national level. And if this is not taking place, you can have the nicest decision at the WTO. It won't help any purpose. Second is the streamlining of existing legislation and sort of adapted administrative processes. And that can help a lot in terms of accelerating. For example, if the vision is Thailand should be more innovative driven, you need to have the IP system going along with this to make it easier to get patents in place, for example. The next thing is conditions in publicly funded research. You will want to have those sort of intellectual property rights be managed in a way that facilitates equitable access. So, I mean, this is just an extract of the range of measures which one could imagine at national level. And that just a few words about sort of international organizations. I think there's also room for contributions which we could make. I talked about sort of resources. Certainly, the international organizations can contribute to mobilizing resources which are needed in order to guarantee access to vaccines and any other health technologies. But I mean, this is something where we suffered from at the beginning of the pandemic, transparency. So, I mean, the organizations, I think, could make a cooperative effort to provide transparency. For example, through, I mean, I could imagine a jointly managed platform, where you find information about the availability. We didn't even know sometimes, what is the supply which is available, where does it go? I mean, that sort of information could be sort of gathered in one place and would make it easier actually to facilitate trade. But also what was proposed, which I think is interesting, a sort of clearinghouse where companies could sort of bring in their concerns with bottlenecks, supply chain bottlenecks. And this is one example, but they could also sort of report on production capacity and distribution, so we would have a clearer picture there. And this is actually important because we did this in a very informal basis. Our Director General had very sort of direct contacts with the CEOs of vaccine manufacturers, and they did tell us where they face supply chain bottlenecks. And we brought this to the attention of the governments concerned, and I'm not claiming in all cases, but at least in some cases, this did help to address those obstacles which were out there. So I mean, transparency, I think, is very important. And then I mentioned procurement, to having this in place, a sound regime. One could also imagine some sort of best practices which are developed so that countries can at least get a source of inspiration of what could be done in this area. So these are just a few examples. I could go on with intellectual property, where I think we could also do more at the level of international organizations. But in the interest of time, because you also want to pick up questions.
Yes, yes, and these measures are in the action plan detailed in the publication, Trade Therapy, Deepening Cooperation to Strengthen Pandemic Defenses by the WTO and World Bank, which I encourage everyone to go and see into detail. Hopefully the action plan is more successful than my diet plan, which is only moderately successful so far. Matthias, so is a paradigm shift needed in trade policy to promote local R&D and manufacturing?
I think in terms of paradigm shift, I think, the international trade regime was built on this idea that we basically open up trade, and we don't care so much if a technology is in the hand of a couple of companies, because we always thought that is kind of trade is open, they will share their products. And now this logic has fallen apart during the pandemic, but also now with the war in Ukraine, climate change. I think a lot of countries, they have realized that they need to increase their resilience, not only the economic resilience, but also in terms of public health. And about a month ago, for example, the German government announced a new measure. They would like that the health sector in Germany not only buys from one supplier, the cheapest supplier, but they can also buy from the second cheapest one. And I think one requirement is also that this one is based in the EU. So they clearly say we want to have not only one source of, for example, APIs, but we want to have various sources. So what does that mean for the health sector? That means probably more expensive purchases, because probably, yeah, the second cheapest is not the cheapest. So all this brings additional costs. This will be, in the end, probably to the detriment of the consumer. Maybe one measure would then also maybe to lower tariffs to offset some of these costs. But I think the paradigm shift is that we're going towards a more decentralized world, which might increase the economic resilience, public health resilience, but also at a higher cost. And of course, there are questions to the WTO regime, because that also involves probably taxes, subsidies, etc. And I think all these needs to be discussed now at the multilateral level.
Lovely, thank you for that. And with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions for the audience. I can see two that the Secretariat has displayed on screen, but is the person asking these questions present at the meeting, and would he or she like to state them, or should I just read them out? Give you 3 seconds to think about that. Okay, I guess it's a secret question from a secret member of the audience.
We wouldn't know details about vaccine companies because they are so secret.
So the question, Ambassador, is it acceptable for vaccine companies to force countries to accept their secret agreements while not being responsible of anything with their vaccines, including dispute settlements that go beyond the WTO? Do any of our panelists wish to take on that question? It's probably an issue about corporate responsibility and whether vaccine companies should be responsible for any of their dealings.
Well, maybe if I can just kick off. This is, of course, in the first place, a matter of a private contract on which WTO law certainly has nothing to say. So we, from the WTO's perspective, this happens, but is not something where we can have a view, because it's plainly outside the area of competence that is, which is covered by WTO agreements. I think the inherent message here is it acceptable? I mean, that's a matter of personal opinion, but again, it's not something you could sort of address as a matter of WTO compliance or not.
Please,
There's no other audiences. I would like to leave one more point, maybe for further other panel to discuss further in details, which is the one thing that will be have affected the healthcare sector and will continue to do so is the supply chain realignment, and which is in a sense linked to the national security issues that is ongoing. There's a debate on friendshoring, which I think the other panel will take up this. This will have implications on when Dr. Sampan asked whether who are going to be our alliances, in the future. This is something like in Thailand we would say the two elephants fighting each other, and the grass is getting stomped on. Well, in this case, maybe Thailand is the grass, but you cannot avoid being on the ground because we are also major players. The thing is, with the supply chain realignment, the United States are bringing back their own strategic industries back to the U.S. And not only healthcare or medicine, but technology and some everything. EV cars, you may have heard this is another issue. So what would Thailand do? Because we are involved from the upstream to downstream in many things. We have little interest here and there. We have to think about who we are going to trade with, to talk to export to import from. Who are we going to innovate together. This is an issue for future negotiations. Like if you are going to start negotiation with the EU soon, the EU, as I told you, is a very major player in terms of healthcare. How are we going to position ourselves with the EU to benefit us? What are our development objectives? We have to think about this. But at the same time, the world is not a happy place right now. Thailand, which is a pretty happy place, and with happy people, but we have to deal with an unhappy world. So we have to be careful who we talk to. My position would be we can talk to everybody, because I would be nice to all ambassadors. I can talk to everybody, but the reality may be a bit harsher, in terms of economics and business. So this is another issue I want to leave with the health.
Yes, Ambassador. And since you were in Davos, I think the general atmosphere is that we can't talk to everybody, and there's a lot of fragmentation in the world there, so a lot of headaches there. I think there are questions from the audience, please.
Thank you very much, panelists. Very interesting and joyful to listen to all of you. My name is Wana. I'm an executive director for ASEAN Training Center for Social Work and Social Welfare. I have two questions. They're separate, but the first question, considering COVID-19 has affected, I would say 1 in 10 of population, world population, and roughly 1 in 1,000 people perish. Aside from that, the period of 3 years, we have long COVID that has affected millions of lives, several millions of lives. So in terms of subsidies and considering economic costs and loss and the treatment required, and whether it's follow-up treatment, monitoring, both healthcare workforces and non-healthcare workforces, those in the economy. What are the international players, like organizations like you, view on these issues of follow-up of COVID-19? And my second question, or the last question, is that I am unsure if those who are not in public health are aware that in Thailand, Ministry of Public Health has used andrographis, Phathalai-Jona, as part of take-home tradition medicines to the patients. So it's been accepted. If you Google this Phathalai-Jona, you'll find several universities who gathered at this event. As such, for IPR, does Thailand have certain kind of policy to promote traditional medicines in the World Economic Forum or macroeconomics, and register it as one of, not a competitor to the vaccine, but as an option? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I believe your first question is an opportunity for our panelists to talk further about the future of global cooperation when it comes to trying to resolve this pandemic and future pandemics. So I think that would be an opportunity to talk about that. The second question is probably more appropriately addressed to the members of the audience here who are from the Ministry of Public Health, and none of us here are from the Ministry of Public Health. But of course, it goes to the issue of domestic production as well and local research. So Matthias might want to come in on that. So I'll leave it to the panelists. Roger, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think when we start speaking about long COVID-19, my takeaway from a recent symposium we co-organized with WHO, WIPO, and WTO, and where the keynote speakers have provided the scientific background to all of this, we are really at the initial stage of understanding what we are talking about. So at this stage, to concrete follow-up action, to take concrete measures as follow-up, I think we are still in the process of understanding, and only then can we talk about sort of follow-up measures. But this said, my expectation is that the kind of questions which will come up when we sort of have a better understanding of long COVID-19 will be very similar to what we are facing in the discussions right now about COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics. The same issues will come up, be it in traditional trade-related areas, be it in intellectual property rights. So I don't expect a major shift in terms of the focus of the discussion when we get to this particular point. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. On the first one, yes, we actually know that that long COVID exists, and also, yeah, it can express itself in various symptoms. And what's for sure, it's an extra burden to the health system, and it's certainly expensive because a lot of these long COVID-related diseases are chronic. For example, there's a higher risk of developing diabetes, and this is very expensive for the healthcare sector to take care of. And also when it comes to R&D, a lot of R&D efforts were now diverted, if I might say, to look into COVID and to the neglect of other diseases. And again, that's, I think, not always welcome. To your second question about traditional medicine, WHO is about to open a center on traditional medicine in India. And because we think it's an important area that we should promote more and look more into it, because a lot of countries, including Thailand, India, China, they have a lot of knowledge to share, and some of that is also very promising. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe we have one final question from the audience.
I thank the moderator for making it a lively session and all our panelists. It was just a question, Roger, on your slide, the first one that you presented. I wanted a little bit of clarification. If you look at your graph and you showed the different movement of the graph, there was a dip in 2015 as well on the cost of products. And I was wondering that whether any comparison in this report has been done on that dip vis-a-vis the dip in 2019. I don't know whether you would like to show that slide, but there's a dip in the, I hope you know what I'm referring to. But what was important is that I thought that dip was also pretty deep in 2015. I was wondering what was the cause, and was it identified? Maybe some kind of global recession or something? Over.
No, I actually have to thank you, because I was asking myself this same question when I traveled to this place, and what is actually the explanation for seeing this dip in 2015? I need to revert to my colleagues. I don't really know, but it's true. It's obvious that there has been a sort of decline in trade also in that period. So not only during COVID-19, but I'm not really in a position to answer that question. So I apologize.
All right. We do have one question, comment from that the Secretary has displayed. I believe it's a comment rather than a request for answers, but the notes that the paradigm shift is needed here. When the time countries has no power of negotiation, global organizations like WTO and WHO have to step in to help and urge corporates to be more socially responsible during the time of pandemic. Not just say out of WTO work. I believe that's just. Do you want to reply to that, Roger?
Well, just two comments on this. And I don't know if the ambassador agrees with me. I would not agree with the statement that that countries have no negotiating power. On the contrary, I think all the power, at least at the WTO, lies with countries in those negotiations. Certainly not with us. So I would disagree with that comment. Then second, this is what I didn't develop in one of my last interventions. Yes, I agree with social responsibility in terms of licensing, for example, in the area of intellectual property. And we do this, actually, we see this happening, WHO in particular, but also on our side, we do talk about this, the need for
for companies to think about social responsible licensing of intellectual property rights. So it's not an unknown. Where it becomes difficult, I keep repeating what I've been saying before, when we move into the area of private law, we can encourage, but in the end, ultimately, it's the decision of the contracting parties, the governments and the companies. And it's not something, again, which is within the area of competence of the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Ambassador?
I can't escape you, eh? No, you know what? This is my second posting in Geneva. I was in Geneva during the Doha round launching. I was there in 1999 to 2003. I was a technical officer for services negotiation. This time I was in Geneva. I can tell you that there has been changes in the dynamism of negotiations, and don't underestimate the interest and the how developing countries and LDCs negotiate. Of course, I feel very sorry for them because some countries don't even have representation in Geneva because of cost, and manpower. But I think many developing countries have found their own voices, and LDCs are very well organized in negotiation important issues. Maybe they are not getting 100% of what they're asking, but negotiation is a give and take. Nobody gets 100%. But I think that the important thing when you negotiate is that you have to be reasonable, and you have to have something to support it. I, for one, I don't like negotiating with people who have no evidence or have nothing concrete to continue. I'll be very frank here. I don't like to negotiate on rhetoric and saying that because I am from developing countries or I am poorer, then blah, 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 blah. But what I want to know is, so what do you want to do? You know that this is your problem. What do you want? What do you see as your solutions? Let's talk about it. That's how we continue negotiations. I think that many countries are doing better at this, provide what they want in very concrete terms, like in other issues like the LDCs development issues. I see many practical and precise and concise proposals. So I would say that people are negotiating better and very well, but you have to continue the negotiations in a very objective manner, cannot just use emotions to negotiate. I think that won't work anymore. But well, on social responsibility, Roger has addressed that. My view is that, of course, WTO as an organization, you cannot ask countries to be more socially responsible, but it is among, up to members ourselves. And I think we are moving into that direction. You are hearing a lot of climate change, food security issues being poised to become the next important issues in the WTO negotiations. I can tell you right now, the future of negotiation, international trade, climate change and trade, or environment and trade, digital economy, and the food security or food insecurity, whatever you say it, and agriculture, and also WTO reform, particularly on dispute settlement. And then, of course, we have other quickly emerging issues of subsidies agreement. I think these things are very, very important, but I applaud many developing countries and LDCs for doing very well in the negotiations, and don't underestimate our voices there. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I do realize that there are frantic hands waving from the back, wanting to ask more questions, but unfortunately, very unfortunately, there's a huge eyeball over there saying that we've run out of time. So these panelists, all of us will still be here during this conference, and I believe there would be opportunities to ask for more questions. But for now, could I ask for a big round of applause for our panelists, please? Ambassador Pimchinok, Roger, Matthias, thank you so much.
Now I don't know what I'm going to say on my second panel.
There will be many questions, I believe, but thank you so much for your insight, and I believe we've learned a lot today and set the stage for the rest of the conference, which we hope will be successful. So thank you very much, and let's see you in the future sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Matthias, Dr. Roger, Her Excellency Pimchinok, and Mr. Nati for a really insightful and informative sections. This is only our opening sessions, and this set background to our conference and also setting the tones for our next 4 sections. So please, if you're interested in what our speakers have been dropping hints on what's going to be in our next 4 sections, please join us. We're going to have 1 more this evening and then 3 more tomorrow. Before we start with our next sections, we're going to have about 10 minutes coffee break, and we'll start again at 3:35. Thank you.